Amelia Grabowski is our guest today at our virtual lunch talk with unfortunately no real lunch, so my apologies for that. She sent me a brief bio, which I will read for you and then say a little bit more. Digital strategist, as she says. Amelia Grabowski is a digital strategist with 5 years of experience connecting museums and public history projects to digital audience in engaging ways. And that I can vouch for. That's certainly things she's done. She's acting social media manager at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History, a volunteer with the wonderful blog Nursing Cleo. She graduated from the Public Humanities program 5 years ago, class of 2015. And as I was thinking back over some of the projects, you did a lot of projects. You worked with the Urban Pond Procession, I think, at Massapequa Pond. And then when we had a big program going with the Fox Point community at the Barton Gregorian School, did an exhibit there. And I have some wonderful pictures of you building that exhibit, actually. And then I think you did your practicum at Lower East Side Tenement Museum, right? So lots of wonderful experience, and then worked to Washington and worked at the Museum of Civil War Medicine and at the Clara Barton office, which I guess had just opened at that point. And then, go ahead. And then moved over from there to the Museum of American History. And how long have you been in American history now?
About 2.5 years.
2.5 years. So anyway, that's my quick introduction. It's a delight to have you join us, and welcome back.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me and for everyone joining without the inducement of kebab and curry, or whatever is the favorite for lunch talks.
Still kebab and curry, I'm afraid.
As I was prepping this presentation, I was like, man, I need to get some Indian food for tomorrow. So I'm going to switch to my screen share so you're not looking at me the whole time. So let's see, share screen, PowerPoint, share. Is it coming through? Probably not. Perfect. So normally in the past, when I've given talks about museum social media, the first part of the talk is about why museum social media is important and why you should invest in your digital teams, but that seems like a very moot point right now, given the pandemic, but also I think it sort of became a moot point when the Museum of English Rural Life posted this. So if you weren't connected to anything digital 2 years ago, the Museum of English Rural Life posted this picture of a ram with the caption, "Look at this absolute unit," and it went legitimately viral. In the museum community, we tend to call things viral that are more feverish, that are like 100 retweets, but this has close to 30,000 retweets plus quote tweets. It was covered in international press. It was included in like year-end reviews of the best things on the internet. It was amazing, and took this very local niche museum and put it on an international map. Since then, the Museum of English Rural Life has gone viral 2 more times, and their followership is on par for what we have at the National Museum of American History. And it's a great example of how social media connects with audiences that can't get to you physically, defines your uniqueness and makes people want to visit, and can expand your reach. The problem is that we can't all post absolute units all the time. So then what will you post? So as I was thinking through what would be useful to you in this presentation, particularly in these sort of funky times for museums, I thought that the most helpful thing I could do would be explain sort of what impacts my social media strategy, and then talk about the lessons learned and how I'm changing that strategy since we've closed the museum and during the pandemic. So I'm gonna walk you through that now. But I meant to introduce this first. So these are examples of places that don't post absolute units, but do fantastic jobs. On the far left is the National Museum of African American History and Culture, which does a great job of both knowing the communities online that they're speaking to and speaking directly to them. They have, when Beyonce released the Homecoming music video, within moments it felt like they had a thread up about HBCUs, there you go. And the symbolism in the video and really engaged a young audience and showed communities of color that it was speaking to them. It also has a way of shaping the content to be very succinct and very hard-hitting and sort of feel like it's your civic duty almost to read it and know, and you want to be a well-informed citizen. They really knock that out of the park. Speaking of parks, I did not plan that segue. The National Park Service has been killing it on Instagram. They pair actual information about parks and wildlife with pop culture references and amazing photos. So this one has a great Bob Ross quote to start it off, and they've really amplified their reach. You know a museum's doing a great job when you're at a party and you tell someone you work at a museum and they'll be like, do you know anyone that works at insert social media museum here? It drives me crazy, but it's a great sign of what's working. And then the third example is the Monterey Bay Aquarium. That's mission is to inspire conservation of aquatic life. And it does that by posts that really spark wonder of aquatic life. And if you ever need calming content, their webcams are great. So these are great strategies, and it's tempting to just want to replicate what works for other museums, but you have to find what works for you. Knowing your resources and then knowing everything else that goes into making your strategy. So your audience's interests and the interests of your target audiences are at the top of that, but also internal interests and needs from exhibit openings and upcoming programs, museum news, donor commitments, new research discoveries, and then things that are trending in the outside world. So when the Cats trailer was trending, we had a debate about whether or not to post our Cats costumes, low-key making fun of it, because that was an opportunity for engagement. So all that is going to come in and make your strategy. And each strategy is unique to a museum, to their goals, to their resources. Monterey Bay couldn't do what it does without killer photographers and webcams. So if you're at an aquarium that doesn't have those resources, you find a different strategy. And then from there, it's up to you. So the thing I think about most when doing social media is something Steve said, of course, which is to be a facilitator and a translator as well as an expert. And I find that that's really my role at the museum, is to create conversations where I'm translating audience needs and interests and feedback to museum stakeholders and translating museum news to audiences in ways they'll find engaging. Other ways I think about this is sometimes I think of it as like an Olivia Pope type spin doctor, where you're finding something that doesn't seem like great content and finding a way to make it relevant to audiences, or like a chat show host that you're constantly knowing what's going on in order to capitalize on those conversations. If you become a museum social media manager, the endings of all television shows will be spoiled for you immediately, because you have to know in case there's a great connection there. You're the audience's advocate, so knowing what they're talking about is key. And then you can share that back to the museum. One of the most rewarding and most challenging parts of being a social media manager is that you are working for a huge invisible audience. At the National Museum of American History, we have about 800,000 followers across our 3 platforms, which is a huge amount. It's more than we ever get in one day at the museum. But myself and the other members of the social media team are the only ones that know their names and their quirks. And you get immediate qualitative feedback as well as quantitative feedback. You're in one of the only positions in the museum that you can get that very fast for your work. So it then becomes your job to translate that and make it real to other stakeholders in the museum. So reporting is a huge part of that. Sharing just really great moments is part of that. One of my favorite is we did a patent week together with our business history exhibition, and we shared that Barbie pink is a patented color, the more you know, and shared one of our Barbie thermoses from the collection, and it started a chain of people responding with their Barbie thermos, which was a great moment to share with people, to be like, this is what can happen on social media and what people are interested in. The other thing to do to make them visible is talk about them how you would real human audiences, using the language of strategy and things like that. Too often we think of social media managers as social media gurus or ninjas or rock stars, which is all meant in lovely complementary ways, but it sort of denies the strategy that's baked into doing that. And so talking about things as visually compelling and engaging in all the ways you would talk about programs or exhibits or things like that helps reinforce that it's similar work happening online as in person, at least in my experience. So once you know your audiences and you advocate for them, the next thing you're doing is writing for them and designing for them. That really working for the audiences starts with you. And the campaign that I have screenshotted here is a place where we really tried to do that. This year's the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment being passed, as you all know, and as you've all seen, every museum and its mother is doing some sort of content for it. And we knew our audience was interested in a more diverse story of it and a story of racism and oppression and division within the suffrage movement, as well as aware of how that was lingering today. We knew that other museums weren't telling those stories or weren't telling all those stories, that a thing that can make the American History Museum is unique is that we can look at how not just African American communities are affected or not just Asian American communities, et cetera, but how all different communities were affected by it. And we knew that if we didn't, we'd get major pushback. So we shared that with the teams to marshal content and made sure that when we started introducing our 19th Amendment content, we leaded with the story that it's more complicated than the 19th Amendment gave women the right to vote, that it was a story of advocacy and continuing struggle and achievements and pushbacks to today. And you can see that in the thread. The other things you can see is the non-language way that we've designed for audiences. So altering images to be landscapes so they appear in your feed without clicking to expand them, taking videos and turning them into GIFs if they don't need sound so they autoplay. Anything that can make it easier for your audience to get engrossed in what you're saying and keep scrolling and not need to click beyond liking or retweeting, or if your ultimate goal is to drive traffic somewhere going there. You want to make it as easy as possible for them to engage with the content, which leads me to my next point of making sure you make the content accessible. For all audiences, accessibility is things like adding alt text so screen readers can read what an image is, and you're engaging all audiences. It's accessible language. We try and write at an 8th grade reading level in our language, and it's captioning on videos. And the thing about accessibility is it's the right thing to do. It aligns with most mission statements, which try and be accessible and inclusive museums. It's a legal requirement for my museum. But it's also a case where the more accessible you make something for one audience, the more accessible you're generally making it for everyone. So a great example is captioning videos. It takes a little bit of time, but if you're captioning videos, you're captioning much more of your audience. We know that 80 to 90% of social media audiences do not turn on sound on videos when they're watching, and you know it's true because you're thinking of all the Instagram stories you've watched without sound now and how you've missed context. And so having captions, you're catching that audience that you're not catching elsewhere. That's the quick overview of what I'm thinking about advocating for an audience on a day-to-day basis. The tension of social media is you're both the audience advocate and have this very intimate connection with them, and you're literally the voice of your museum. And you're navigating all that. And a lot of that you saw in the slide with all the different influences of the museum. One of the fun things about being the voice of the museum is you have the opportunity to truly make it a voice. No one wants to talk to an automated operator or a building or that sort of thing. They want to talk to a person. And what we're seeing as social media progresses is personal accounts are prioritized more and more by algorithms and also by individual user content. That what's going viral is people's individual tweets, their storytelling, not accounts. Even if the Twitter thread that's viral is like the same thing 3 museums posted that week, that an individual posted it makes it feel more authentic and people are more likely to engage. So while you can never be a secret individual as your museum, you can replicate that tone that people want to engage with. This is one of my favorite examples. The squirrel in question is Tommy Tucker, who was a squirrel in the 1940s with a wardrobe that rivals any wardrobe I've seen. He had 100 dresses made for him by his owner and would travel the country putting on the dresses, putting on fashion shows and raising money either for tuberculosis or the war effort, which is just a great story. But if I were to tell it online, I wouldn't tell it the way I just told it to you. I would want to drive home the interest of it and really make the story personal. So when we started with Instagram, we started with felt cute, might delete later, to use the language of it and then go from there, and saw much higher returns than when we told the story in a more straightforward way. When we shared it on Twitter, we used ladies, if he does this, he's not your man, he's the styling and philanthropic squirrel, Tommy Tucker. And using those personal language and meme language is a way that we found to engage much more of the audience. We also want to use the voice to say something. We know that young audiences respond much more to places that have social justice values and advocate for them. We know that people want to follow something with a point of view because that's what sets you apart. And then from there, sort of what you can say is a reflection of your individual museum. So at a federal museum, we're pro-voting, and we can say vaccines worked in the past, are our two like big things I can advocate. Beyond that, we're pretty neutral. At other museums I've worked at, you have more leeway based on the museum and the community. But there's power to sort of not being able to say a lot too. It's the flip of with great responsibility comes great power. And one of the things I've really enjoyed at a federal museum is that because we sort of are kind of the staid cousin of other museums, once we've said it, it's part of the national record, and we're able to say, like, this isn't up for debate. These stories are American history, and they're important to us and should be important to you. And one of the campaigns I'm proudest of is really building up our Pride Month content to do that it wasn't like 1 or 2 posts in the month, that we treated it the same way we treat Black History Month, Women's History Month, Hispanic Heritage Month, and that we're working towards treating Asian American Pacific Heritage Month and Indigenous Peoples Heritage Month. That it's a month full of stories that tell a diversity of stories of civil rights, of arts and culture stories, of achievement in sports, all sorts of things, to say this is part of American history. So the last thing I'm thinking about as I'm building content is just what will stop the scroll. You're competing not only against other museums and what's interesting there, but also literally against Netflix and whatever a policymaker has tweeted that day and anything else in the news feed. And you know for yourself, and if you have missed it, next time you see your parents or an older relative, have them watch you browse content online, and they'll say within 30 seconds, how do you read so fast? And you realize you're not reading, your channel surfing. So what is gonna stop people are compelling images, great stories, something that connects to them and makes them have a double take, because what you wanna have happen is what happened with this article. We had new photography of this object, an amazing story, and a blog post, and this person stopped her scroll, read the story on Instagram, clicked the link in bio, read the whole blog post, and then came back and told us about it, which is such a high level of engagement. It's the goal we shoot for, that we've reached her on all these different levels. But to do that, it started with these amazing photos. It started with a compelling story in the comment that wanted her to learn more. And it was timed, I think we originally published this story during award season when people were talking about dress designs and things like that. So both the content and the timing of it is part of that equation to try and capture people. That's how business normally works. But then there's a pandemic. And suddenly everything is online, and people who, and you have a lot more willing collaborators than you had before, because no one's working on physical programs or installing exhibits or things like that. But at the same time, your audience is more distracted. There are more options. You're now competing against people like John Krasinski putting together the entire cast of Hamilton for a little girl, and people thinking about like how they're going to get toilet paper and paper towels and things like that. So I have not figured out the secret to pandemic social media. I will let you know if I do, but here are the things I've been thinking about over the last couple of months. First, to steal a line from Dolly, figure out who you are and do it on purpose. The museums that I think have been doing the best are ones that had a strong sense of identity and knew their resources before, so they could dive right in. The Shed Aquarium went viral the first week with this video that you probably saw of penguins touring the museum, but they knew what they were. They knew their mission was to share stories to increase appreciation for life aquatic by sharing cute animals, that cute animals were their resource, and that they had to walk the animals anyway, so that they could do this. And I think it was captured on a staff. I found it wasn't a high production value. The one thing I will say is don't put staff life at risk for a viral social media moment. It is not worth it. This is something that had to happen anyway, and you saw other museums that then went in to make mirroring content get a lot of pushback of like, yeah, that wasn't necessary to send somebody in to do that. The other place that has been doing really well on social media, I think, is StoryCorps. And I know that there's a larger conversation about StoryCorps and oral history and ethics, but putting that all to one side for a moment and just talking about the digital content, they are an organization that is founded on the belief that life is improved by human connection through storytelling, and it doesn't have to be in-person storytelling. And so that's what they've been doing in this. They've been focusing on a national story, even though they're headquartered in one of the hotspots. They identify as a national organization, and they've held that identity throughout the crisis, and they've taken their existing assets. Years ago, they started producing these short animated videos of their sort of best moments of oral history, and they're sharing those to create these moments of human connection, which is, I don't know about you, but what I'm really craving is sort of a 2-minute video. It's about all the content, or all the attention I have. I don't have to read anything, and I get sort of this moment of catharsis where I either laugh or cry or have some sort of emotional release that isn't based on the pandemic, but can help me contextualize it and remember sort of life outside of it. So I think they're another strong example. Part of this is not assuming that your audience is bored. That at the beginning of this, we heard a lot of people on Twitter and elsewhere say, like, our audiences are captive now. We'll have more of their attention than ever before. And that's just not true. As you know, people are frightened about what's happening. They're worried about the job market. They're worried about going to the grocery store. They're either working all the time, trying to keep their job, or because they're figuring out how to do it in new ways, or they're teaching their kids 4th grade math, or learning how to do a sourdough starter. There's a lot happening. They might be craving things, craving connection, craving distraction, but they're not just bored. They're not like locked in a room with endless resources and only your Twitter feed. So you're having to think of how to engage them in new ways. Some of the things we've tried to do is make our content even shorter and more snackable, because people just don't have the attention spans right now for more than that. I find that's true in my life. It took me like 3 days to read one email because I just couldn't comprehend it. And to not assume we know what's happening in their life. If we're welcoming a broad audience with diverse experiences, this is going to include people that have kids at home, people that are going in, people that don't have resources to stockpile, people that have been furloughed, people, all sorts of people. So you don't want to make any broad assumptions. The last thing that I've been thinking a lot about is how to use the whole spectrum of digital content right now. Too often when I hear digital, I think in meetings, I think they mean social media, because I think if you're making something that can be used online, why wouldn't you want to share it on social media? And I think a lot of museum stakeholders often think about social media as a bullhorn, where it's a great way to reach a lot of people at once. And I always want to complicate that conversation to say, like, who are you trying to reach? What audience behavior are you trying to say? Because social isn't always the best fit. In non-pandemic times, we have this conversation a lot when it comes to advertising, that Twitter is sort of a language a lot of people know, and they're eager for tweets to promote things, but a good old Facebook event or emails can be better because it's more targetable. You can reach people that you think are, if you're promoting an event, are geographically close to you and have interest. It's also platforms that you're more used to then having some sort of transaction on, that you're less likely, I think, to buy a ticket off of Twitter than off of Facebook, just because you're used to buying tickets. I have no studies to prove that. That's my own belief. And so we're reframing that conversation now in the pandemic, not on ROI for ticket sales, but what type of interaction the audience is seeking where, and where it's the most appropriate. Because the last thing you want to do right now is lose your audience. If you're not posting anything, they might go stagnant. You might move down in the algorithm, but no one's going to unfollow you for not posting something. But if you post something that seems tone deaf, they might unfollow you. And once they unfollow you, you're highly unlikely to get that follower back. So the spectrum I've been thinking about now is content that I control where I see it. On one hand, so this is, I've Googled, I wanted to know how they did morgues during the pandemic in 1918. I Googled it, there's a museum resource, and I read it there. And you can work towards that by boosting the SEO, by creating those resources, that sort of thing. And then it moves on a spectrum to sort of my email, where I'm not actively Googling a question, but I can opt into the email. Like, I read the subject line, I think, yeah, I want to read this now, and read a story there. To the very far end, where it's social media news feeds, where all you do is you open Twitter or Instagram or Facebook, and you don't really say, I want to see this type of content, and aren't controlling that as a user, nor is the person posting it able to control what you're seeing it in content in context of. So it might be sourdough starter museum content baby picture, or it could be death museum content death, and having that knowledge and trying to slot it in the content that's the best fit there, and create moments to opt in on the things that are sort of on the far side, not opt in side of the spectrum, if you're dealing with heavier things or just gross and disturbing things, to go from there. So those are the lessons I've learned so far. I haven't figured it all out, but these are a few examples of things we've done that I thought have worked well. The one thing we know we really have going for us at American History is the breadth of our collections, and that they are now almost entirely all online in some way, shape, or form. So we posted a challenge, send us an emoji and we'll send you an object. We find that this sort of thing works really well for our audiences all the time because it's low buy-in. You don't have to think really hard about which emoji you post. You probably just pick one out of your frequently used, and then you get something customized to you. It uses our collection search as a resource. It also drives traffic up because the more we reply, the more people see it, and so on and so forth. And we received really positive feedback for that. We also just shared this very lovely picture of a moon. It's a different type of Instagram post for us in that we're using we language as opposed to the slightly less personal language we use mostly. We didn't try and tell a whole story. It's really about the image, and it performed really well. And then the last thing we did was similar to the first challenge of we've let teachers and parents know that if they send us things that their kids are interested in, we'll send them resources back to that. And responding to that very particular need, we've received a lot of feedback and been able to send things and then get really lovely things like this back, where one parent reached out to say her daughter liked ballet. We sent her our collection of ballet costumes and challenged her to draw one for us, and she did. And that's been really rewarding to feel like we're really meeting a need and reaching a particular audience. And hopefully we'll continue to grow our connections with those audiences, both during the pandemic and afterwards. So that's my very quick overview of all things social media. But because social media can cover really all the things, I wanted to leave a lot of time for discussion and to answer any of your questions. And if you don't have questions now, but have them later, you can always reach out to me via email and Twitter.
Thanks, Amelia. Okay, I am manning questions here, and Guillaume has got the first question. So Guillaume, you can, or a great bundle of questions actually. So you should be unmuted by now, so go for it.
Okay, thank you so much. I had a question about, you mentioned, you talked about Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. I was wondering about whether museums could build on something that is a bit more permanent than these kind of very quick posts on these feeds that go by very quickly, and work with YouTube, like creating videos that are like showcasing the collections and stuff like that, but also using all the trends and like the language of social media that we see in YouTube. And there is an example of that worked pretty well, which is the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago, where they have a resident YouTube channel that seems to be quite successful. And so I'm wondering why more museums didn't jump on this kind of train and have resident YouTube channels to showcase their collections.
Yeah, that's a really great question. Because YouTube is, according to Pew, the most used social media channel. I have quibbles with that study, but it's a highly used thing. It's used like Google, and it cuts across a wide variety of audience demographics. The Field Museum example is a really great example. It's, what is it called?
The Brain Scoop.
The Brain Scoop, thank you. And I think the challenge there is generally resources, that it's a similar reason. One of the reasons that museums aren't jumping onto TikTok very quickly as opposed to other new platforms is because video production is traditionally something they haven't had in-house. And so it either requires staff to learn to do it or new staff to be hired. We at American History do have a YouTube channel and have a video producer in-house, but she's not a video producer for YouTube. She does that as part of her work. And so it's been really fun for us to experiment and see what works and what doesn't. but without a full-time person that you would have dedicated to another social media channel, we haven't had the impact that the Field Museum has. But I think that's a great thing, and that is, social media is both permanent and temporary. It's a temporary experience for most audiences, but once it's out in the world, you can never delete it. It's people, however, generally aren't going to like search on Twitter to see what you said about this thing. That's not where they're going. So pairing, either pulling from, what I usually am doing is pulling from other resources that are more evergreen and stable. Generally our exhibits, our collection search, and our blog. And then if I'm creating a lot of new content, trying to think about how I can feed that work back into a long form thing. So one of the things that is on my rainy day list of projects is Twitter threads that we've written that are very popular, to see if we can turn those back into blog posts to create an evergreen thing that's more Googleable and is there for the longer term, and also appeals to a different audience because not everybody is on social media, and blog posts are an easier way to reach our email audience or people that are just reaching us via Google. But that sort of is separate from the YouTube question, but YouTube is a huge thing. There's been a lot of success with it. And I think it's like anything else, that the Field Museum excelled in creating a unique voice, which I think has been where museums have been most successful on social, is having something, on YouTube, is having something unique to offer, as opposed to sort of trying to mirror a Ken Burns video or Antiques Roadshow or something that you can get elsewhere. Is what are you offering that's unique, and what are people going to tune back in for? That's a great question.
I am going to Deborah Krieger.
Hi.
Unmuted now.
So one thing that you've kind of alluded to, and in the last question, so the social media is forever, and if something that is not an appropriate post gets through gets sort of under the radar, it could last forever and be a really big source of embarrassment. What are some good examples of like apologies or like amends that you've seen when organizations have just completely screwed up?
Monterey Bay is my go-to example. To Monterey Bay, their Twitter strategy includes a lot of using the language of memes and pictures of wildlife to get engagement. And they posted a picture of a large sea otter with, I'm not going to remember the exact caption, but it was language that sexualized the sea otter and was borrowed from communities of color that felt appropriative when it was in the caption. And it received a lot of pushback. And they published a whole thread apologizing off the bat, sharing what they did wrong, sharing sort of how they learned, and I think also sharing a little bit of what they were going to do in the future to correct it. I think that if you can show the action of correction is generally a good thing in apologies in any part of life. The National Archives, when the news broke that it wasn't just a picture, it was like a hologram that they had at the entrance that was the 1913, I think, suffrage march, from if you were walking this way, and then if you walked that way, it was the 2017 Women's March, and a couple of the signs of the Women's March had been blurred out. When that news broke, that wasn't a social media decision or error. The social media team didn't make that exhibit, but they were sort of on the front lines of receiving feedback and communicating the apology. And museum leadership crafted the apology, but I thought things that were really smart about how it was shared on social were, it was shared over 2 tweets, but each tweet stood alone, and that it had an apology and it had a reference to action in the future in it, that it couldn't be taken out of context. And it had a photograph of the entrance to the exhibit with it that added more context to the conversation. Because when that story broke, it was, if you hadn't seen the exhibit, it was really hard to imagine where that picture was and how it was being used. And so I thought those were two really good examples. But just apologizing forthright. The other thing is to know to go quiet until you've addressed it, because you don't want to appear to be ignoring it. I think are some of the best examples I've seen.
Sorry, just bear with me. I'm just looking for Jim McGrath, who's had a question as well to unmute. There we go. Sorry. So, go ahead, Jim.
Sorry, I used my powers. Hi, Amelia. It's great to see you again.
Hi. Usually I'm the one asking you questions. Pressure's on.
No, no, I thought this was great. I have two questions because I'm annoying, but one is kind of like either how you think about your own personal account in addition to all this stuff, or like who you think is really doing an interesting job of like, you know, taking advantage of the fact they're not connected to an institution, but also, of course, we're connected to institutions in lots of ways. The professionalization of the web is terrible in some aspects. And then I think the other question was like just, and you've talked about it sort of briefly, is like how, and especially now if you're having more people, you know, getting interested in the kind of work you do or having more time to do the work, to sort of offer feedback, like how do you like navigate the workflow of all of this? And like, for folks like our students who are maybe thinking about this stuff, like what's that experience of like being in a room and sort of fitting in the social media agenda and stuff?
Yeah, those are really great questions, and questions we are actively discussing at the museum at the moment. So this is practice for my next meeting. For the personal accounts versus museum accounts, it can be really complicated. And for me, part of the complication is that that I'm at a federal museum, and while everyone has the rights they have, there's guidelines about like if you're doing this on your personal account, you cannot use federal resources, which includes Wi-Fi, to do it and things like that. And so that's a complicating factor. But more generally, I think it's about you as a person with a personal account, what the goal is for you. So there's some people that like just really love their content matter and want to share a lot of those things. And then there's other people that want to be engaged in the professional conversation and talk about strategy, which is, I think right now, and you guys can tell me, more where my personal account falls. I think Erin Blasco is another example that she, like, as a content, she really loves Aquaria. That's not what her account is about. Her account is about social media strategy and things like that. And so it's, for you as a person, it's knowing what you want to say and saying it. I think also being a person is a huge part of it. That you don't want to do something that's going to create a problem for your communications team at your museum, please. But the sharing wrestling content or sharing pictures of your dog or your sourdough starter is what makes you human, and it helps make connections. Because I think Twitter in the museum field is one of the most rewarding experiences, that it's a really wonderful community and a great place to workshop things. Sometimes that workshopping can get challenging because you don't want to ever tip your cards and share something that's secret, and knowing that balance. And then if you're at a museum and not in charge of social, the social team, I'm sure, would be happy to talk to you about sort of what their rules of thumbs are that they think about for posting for themselves. So for me, the thing I tell staff is if you need a badge or a Smithsonian login to see it, it's still secret. So don't post about it. Once it's on the website though, you're good to go. And every now and again, you'll email somebody and be like, that hasn't been announced. And they'll email you back the webpage and you'll be like, okay, it has been announced. The other thing that I think about is like that staff member that intimidates you, or that donor you're talking to. Just imagine that they have text alerts on your Twitter feed. And if you just think about if you'd be comfortable with that. And oftentimes there's a way to slightly reshape content. The other thing is your drafts are great. Sometimes you just need to type something and walk away and think about whether you want to say it that way. But it's a challenging thing to navigate. It's also rewarding. And then your second question about navigating workflows, it's interesting is the answer. There's sort of, I feel like it depends on who you're working with, how your organization structures digital and how it values digital. So if you're someplace that everything needs to have a digital component, you might be advocating in the room to make sure that the assets are in place. So the thing I find myself saying most is remember to photograph the objects before they go on display. And then talking about what's the right digital fit, that not everyone has equal literacy in digital tools, and the digital landscape changes so much that in the past you might really have never ever put a QR code in an exhibit. No one's going to download a QR code reader. And now that our phones read them automatically, I find myself being like, this is a great fit for a QR code, or this is a better, and so you have that conversation about this is better for blog or social and things like that. And that's a lot easier to have in the room. And when you're leading with goals and target audiences for a project, it's really interesting right now. And speaking in the field in general, people are having similar experiences with different motivations. The other social media managers I talk to, some are dealing with people wanting to have a lot of digital output right now because they're scared for their jobs. Others are bored. Others feel that there's been a directive from leadership to do it. But no one who I've seen has expanded their digital team in this time. And digital skill set is a real skill set that people who aren't digital professionals, even if they're amazing digital power users, can only help you so far. So it's having really frank conversations about capacity, I think, is the only thing that I found. We at American History are trying to set forth clear objectives right now to remind people that long lead digital work is hugely valuable, that while this might last until 2021, it won't last forever. Something I say a lot now is a robust object record is the gift that keeps on giving, and things like that. And just being really frank with people about what it takes. The other thing that we're thinking about, and I'm starting to see other organizations think about, is how to offer training for people that are experiencing digital in new ways. Susan and I were chatting before the meeting about the ways our family are now learning new digital skill sets. And I think that's true both outside of work, where audiences might be more willing to engage with different content, and inside of work, where people have more time to learn digital or whatever the case may be, and to make those resources there so that people know in the short term, but also hopefully you improve your digital literacy overall to have more robust conversations in the future. That being said, it's an evolving conversation, so I'll let you know how it works.
No, thanks so much. That was great.
All right. Amanda, I think you should be unmuted now for your question.
Hi, my name is Amanda. You mentioned TikTok really briefly, and I just wanted to ask a question to sort of get you to elaborate on how you see that platform being utilized or not by museums going forward. I've seen a couple of museums and similar institutions like collecting hundreds of thousands of followers in an extremely short amount of time on TikTok, because it's like this extremely like fast moving platform. And in particular, I was wondering whether you think museums will begin to actively seek out the personnel and resources that you mentioned a lot of them lack to produce video-based content, as opposed to a lot of these other platforms which are so text-based. And if so, whether you think like that, to what extent you think that can be a useful thing and a practical thing for museums kind of now or in the really close future.
I think TikTok's a really, yeah, I think I cut off the end of your question there, so tell me if I missed something. But I think TikTok's a really, really interesting example for museums and really challenging, because the other part of TikTok is the ethical rights part, that they don't have great privacy, and their target audiences are often under 18 audiences, and there's been some major data leaks. So I think that in particular with TikTok will be a large part of museums' negotiations, and it'll be interesting to see who chooses not to engage there to take a stand for that, or I'm predicting that federal museums won't be able to, because we have such a high level of personally identifiable information security that we need to reach. Who will use that as an excuse not to be on TikTok, and then who will take the risk? Like the Washington Post is a great example of a sort of it's not a museum, but it's so you wouldn't necessarily think immediately that the Washington Post is going to have a killer TikTok, but it does. And then there's the question of resourcing for it. I think that that's going to be an unpredictable thing coming out of this time period, is as museums are struggling financially, I think some museums won't invest in new technology or will try and get fewer staff to do more things, particularly smaller museums. And then I think other museums might go whole hog on experimenting with things that sort of, if we're going to go out, we're going to go out swinging. So I think that will be reflected in there. I think the other thing that makes TikTok a hot topic of conversation for museums is that's really where youth audiences are engaging. Facebook is just dead to young people. And they have Instagrams and they have their Finstas, but they're not there to engage with organizational accounts, and Twitter is sort of dying, as sad as that makes me. It will live on much like Facebook will, but it's not where, if you want to engage with Gen Z, not where they are. But TikTok is, and so I think that's a call to action for museums if they want to be there, to consider that. I think another thing will just to see how long it will last. It's certainly built up more than sort of other new technologies have. But this was a lot of the conversation that was happening around Snapchat a couple of years ago, and Snapchat has sort of flamed out. TikTok has more of a it's less temporary content than Snapchat, which makes it easier to justify bang for your buck to museum stakeholders and to share. Like the Washington Post has a TikTok, but the producer then shares it on Twitter many times a day, and it's getting huge numbers of engagement there for everybody that doesn't download the app. That's something it has in its corner. If museums don't start using TikToks, I think what they will do is start listening heavily on TikToks, because you see a lot of amazing history content and how young people are engaging with it, and sort of, not to call it the Hamilton effect, because that really simplifies it, but sort of this Hamilton effect of people who are engaging with history content in new ways and really, what's the word I'm looking for? Not irreverent ways that make it really accessible. And I think that even if you don't have a TikTok account, that's something that can be mirrored in other forms of interpretation and can be a way to reassess what the base level of knowledge that your audience is bringing into any sort of topic. So that's my very long TikTok answer.
Steve, I think you're up next.
Well, the question won't surprise you, the kind of question, and that's about where social media fits in the bureaucracy of the museum. Sort of, first of all, what kind of policy manuals you work out of, and what kind of debate goes on over those policy manuals. And then who actually looks at things? Can you post your tweets on Instagram without anybody else approving them, or is there some sort of approval process like there might be for exhibit scripts? And then how you work with folks in different departments. Are you part of public affairs? Are you part of education? Where does social media fit in a fairly traditional, old-fashioned kind of museum?
We're in the thick of the bureaucracy. It's great. So at the Smithsonian, it's a very large museum as part of a larger institution. So there's a lot of bureaucracy. And I'll talk mostly about that. At my previous position at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine, it was a much smaller place. So I can talk a little bit about sort of the two very different experiences. At the Smithsonian and at Civil War Med, I was in the education department because social media at its core is a daily interpretive program where you're telling stories the way you would on a tour or a public program, and you're working with content producers and content knowledge experts like curators, but you're ultimately sort of putting that audience spin on them. So it's been a good fit for those things. I've seen social media be a good fit at a lot of museums. It's in the communications office now for obvious reasons. I've seen conversations about whether it should be part of curatorial teams because it's working so closely with knowledge production and dissemination, and it's a new form of publishing. I've seen conversations about having it be in almost facilities teams because it's a similar workflow of like there's an exhibit coming and we plan for it, and there's editing and things like that. So we're all over. At the Smithsonian, every museum is governed by Smithsonian directives for all sorts of things, and there's one specifically for social media, which is SD 814, if you Google Smithsonian SD 814, I think it's a public document. You can read it. It's really legalese. But that says things like we can't promote other brands. We can't, we need to use alt text. We, trying to think of some of the other, we can't have a political stance. Those sorts of things are in SD 814. At the Smithsonian, we also then have a social media manager's handbook, which takes that and sort of breaks it down and has more specific examples to share, and also has best practices that you can share, and is sort of is intended to be an onboarding resource, and also something that if another museum staff member has a question about why you can't hyperlink text in, well, that's a bad example, but something that's not best practice, you have a resource to go back to. Because at the Smithsonian, every tweet I write is not reviewed. Generally, I'm pulling interpretation from something that's been reviewed and published elsewhere. So an exhibition page, a blog post, an object record, or a Smithsonian Mag article are where I'm pulling content from, but that's not 100% of the time. If I feel that I'm introducing new interpretation, or in condensing the interpretation might be changing the meaning of something, I'll run it by a content expert to do that. But generally, my tweets are not, they're definitely not reviewed on a language level. I'll share campaign plans with senior leadership for the year overall and high priority projects. But most things I have a lot of independence with, which is great because you can be hyper responsive, but then the onus is on you to know all the rules and follow them. So I find that's much more what I end up doing is reminding people that rules exist, because a lot of people aren't in the Smithsonian endorsement policy and their digital policy in their day-to-day lives, and just see a great link that they want you to share. So you find yourself being like, I didn't sign up to explain rules, but that being the job. It's Civil War Med, where it was much smaller. I wrote my own rules, which was great. And we sort of decided what we thought good content was and held ourselves to that standard. And with that, I sort of had carte blanche from the museum to do what I wanted. So I would, if I was doing a campaign, I would just verbally tell the director. And I don't think he ever asked a follow-up question on social, now that I think about it. And just knowing, again, that anything that was done had to be reported out on the other side. So at the small museum, that was monthly reports to the director and quarterly reports to the board. At a larger museum, there's a lot more reporting. So I do weekly reports to our sort of C-suite leadership, monthly reports to the provost, donor reports, and annual reports. So that's sort of a quick intro to the bureaucracy of it. I think it's a lot about sort of knowing where the rules are and where you can push the boundaries and where you can't, and where you feel comfortable taking on the risk, and where you want to have the buck stop on somebody else's desk is often the question.
Thank you.
Asami, if I'm pronouncing your name right, sorry. I think you're up next. I just unmuted you.
You got it right.
Okay.
Thanks for the talk. I was curious about if you were to add a new member to your team, you know, what sort of person you're looking for, because assuming that the technicalities, you know, like Photoshop skills or video editing skills are, you know, obvious requirements, I think it's really hard to judge people on like aesthetics and like, do you have the eye for good things, and are you aware on the tone of what it sounds like what you're publishing? That seems to be really difficult to determine in a job interview. And also it's something that typically grad students aren't necessarily trained on, and I thought it was interesting how your process worked out, or what you will be looking for now that you're on the other side.
Yeah, that's a really great question, and that's really hard, because I think the most valuable skill for social media is the ability to sort of zoom out and see all the connections. That, like, an example would be if one curator needs a boat tweet for a donor obligation and another curator is announcing like a train donation or something. This is random examples. that like you might then package it as transportation week, and then you need to pull the story of like the Pullman car porters and how women did road trips to advocate for suffrage to make it diverse storytelling, and having that view, which is a hard thing to ask about in a job interview. I haven't hired anyone in my current position, so I don't know how I would ask that. But the other parts of it, what I will say is every social media and digital job I've applied for has had a skills test, which is how sort of, because you can ask sort of the good interview question of like, tell us about a time that you struck the right tone or responded to a trending topic. And it's easy to have, it's easier to have like one example to say you did it, and knowing that there's always a larger process and a larger team behind anything that's happening in real life. But to test how one person would respond to something, I think skills tests are the thing that most digital teams that hire have found to do it. They often also have writing samples as part of the job application. And then the other thing I would say is you probably don't, as you're hiring someone, don't want to have someone with the exact same skills and the exact same point of view as you have. Currently at American History, the other member of the social media team also grew up in Maryland. We played the same sports as kids. Like we know a lot of the same people, which is lovely. It's lovely to meet someone that has fun connections that you can talk about how great Maryland is, but we don't bring diverse viewpoints to the work and the storytelling. And it's something we talk a lot about, is that if more people are to join our team, we want somebody that's not like from Western Maryland, that can spot different, flag different things that might read wrong to audience members, and also bring different connections and points of view and things like that. So that's the fast hiring question. I'm not sure if I answered your question.
I think you did, yeah, thanks.
All right, can you take a couple of more? Amelia, are you flagging without kebab and curry to keep you going?
I'm good. My phone's been ringing. Let me just glance down and make sure that it's not my boss being like, call me now. Oh, no, good. All good. People are resetting Outlook appointments to be Teams meetings.
Okay.
I'd love more questions.
Okay, all right, we got two more. Sharon, you should be unmuted now for your question.
Hi, Amelia, thank you so much for sharing your work with us today. I have two pretty generic questions. The first is, what do you think the future of museum social media would look like, especially in light of COVID-19 right now? And I've seen so many new things that museums are putting on their social media accounts right now. And also, do you think there's a tendency for more video content in the near future? And also the last one is, any suggestions for anyone who's interested in working in museum social media?
Yeah, so, say that last part of your question again. It was a little fuzzy on my speaker.
Oh, just any suggestions for someone who wants to work on social media and whether is new to the field?
Yeah. So I'm going to answer your questions out of order. So the first question about video content, I think we'll see a huge uptick in video content right now when we go back and into the fall, leading into, especially if we're quarantined again with the second wave. That seems to be the way that a lot of museums are talking about it, and particularly museum leadership. Most museum leadership gets to leadership by working their way through museums in a long career. So video is sort of a familiar way to think about digital experiences, which is great. It's a great way. I'm not knocking it at all. It is a resource intensive way. And I think the big question I have is, a lot of museums are producing video tours and things like that. Is anyone watching them? I'm the worst person to ask, because after a full day of working in a museum, the last thing I want to do is walk through another gallery on YouTube. I want to turn off my screen and walk outside or things like that. So I think that that's going to be the big question, is what audiences are really engaging with. And I think that we'll see fewer people engaging with digital video projects across the board as time goes on, and sort of these Disney and Sondheim sing-alongs and live concerts get more and more commonplace and feel less special. However, this is the first time for all of us. I could be very wrong. So we will see. And then I think it'll be interesting to see long-term if there's more investment put in video. And I think it's a gamble. I think some people will, just like some people will always now have like a stack of Clorox wipes and things. Museums will recognize that digital audiences are really powerful and also want to be prepared for more moments like this and invest in more of that work going along. I think though some museums will swing the other way and have missed the in-person experiences so much that they'll really continue investing there in them. And I think that a lot of the conversation around in-person experiences sounds like it's going to be really resource and financially intense, especially as museums think about taking out physical interactives so people aren't touching the same things, and what it would take to make museums, our museum programs more social distance safe. And I think it just remains to be seen how long that's going to go, if that's truly the new normal, as people have been saying, or if that's normal for now and we're going to want to get back to how we were behaving before. Museum social media, I think, has a role in that. And I think I'm hoping that if not video, there will be more investment in digital teams and more conversation about digital strategy and digital prioritization. And some museums are doing that great now. I've been really excited by the conversations we're having at my workplace, but I think that that's something that everyone has room to grow from where they are. How social media will fit into that is a great question. I think that digital storytelling is always going to be important. Social media, I think, is sort of like email, that it's here to stay, but is losing its novelty in that, you know, I know from my personal experience, the only reason I check Facebook now is for baby pictures and because I work in social, that I'm not using it as a social platform anymore. It's more of an inbox. And I think we'll see that happen more and more in things like TikTok, take off, but maybe take off and sort of have a quick rise and fall as the next thing goes in. So I think the key part, if you're looking at a career in museum social, is to keep learning and figure out ways to keep learning, and also to really learn how to listen to your audience, know about audiences, and tell good stories, because whatever the platform is, you'll still need to tell good stories and think creatively how to shape something that was an article or was an exhibit into an experience for a screen. It's just sort of which screen you're on, what the requirements of that screen are, will shift. And that sort of goes to my advice if you're starting out thinking about a career in museum social, is to think about storytelling. If you're not on the 3 big platforms, get on them. I'm not on TikTok. I probably should be, to know more about it, at the very least as a lurker, and to look for opportunities to try things out. So definitely write blog posts, because you're going to have writing samples as you apply to things. If there's opportunities to run social, the first time I ever did social for money was at Brown. One of my work study jobs was with the Refusing to Forget project and setting up their social media accounts, which was huge to experiment with things and see how it works. I have a feeling that organizations from museums to like local humane societies are going to be looking for a lot of social volunteers in the future. So there's an opportunity there as well. And just doing that in a way that's sane for your life. And that, because that's the other huge part of being in social, is you have to also know what it's like to be a normal human, because that's who you're marketing to. And so the social media managers often say, like, we're the worst ones to ask because we're constantly looking at these things and involved. But making time for yourself to like have a life outside of work is going to make you better at your work. Are my big pieces of advice.
I think we had one more question. Do you mind, Amelia?
Oh, go for it.
Okay, all right. It was Guillaume who had asked the first question, I think had a follow-up.
That's great.
Go ahead, Guillaume.
Yeah, thank you very much. I was wondering what you thought of all of these social media companies being able to constantly tweak the way that the information is conveyed on their platforms, and therefore change the rules of what's successful at a given point in time. And I can remember when Twitter changed its feed from being retro-chronological to being algorithmically driven. And like I must imagine that that must have changed all of your social media strategies. And so does it feel like an uphill battle to constantly try and find what's going to please the current, situation on said platform?
I often call it the Wild West. Like the big one for me was the day that Twitter just doubled their character count.
Yeah, definitely.
It changed how you can tell stories, and we all hated it going in, and we ended up loving it because we can say more. But it's really changed the nature of Twitter and the conversations on Twitter. It's sort of the rules of the game. It's it can be annoying, but it also, like, when I get annoyed by it, I go back to Twitter and how grateful I am to have 240 characters now, or 280 characters, as opposed to 140. And like things before, like I remember where you used to have to like hard retweet things and copy and paste the things. And so I do think that they're improving. I think the most challenging thing is where they're often, and some, well, they all do this. They often say they're changing it in one way, and user data shows that that's not actually how it's changed. So Facebook said it was prioritizing video content. Video content performs more poorly for us than any other sort of content on Facebook. They said they were prioritizing conversations. Posts with a lot of comments don't perform any better than any other posts. I think Twitter says it's bringing back the blue checkmark program and that it's stalled, and like people are randomly getting blue check marks, and you'll have like people being like, well, they got one, why can't we? And like, I don't know who they knew in Twitter. And so I think that that's the challenging, is that there's a lot of saying one thing and doing the other. That being said, I think one of the great things about it is that it's when there's a big change like that, it's a story that's on the morning news. And so people who aren't digital natives are going to hear about it in some other way in their day. And I find that people are really understanding of knowing that there's an algorithm that powers things, and that we want to experiment to feed the algorithm, and that the algorithm changes and things aren't going to perform the same way that they did in the past. That's, knock on wood, my colleagues have always been really, really supportive when that's happened. So it's a challenge, but it also is sort of fun that they change the rules. It makes it feel like an adventure. Yeah, it probably says something very odd about my personality.
That's a good last sentence to end with, the oddness of Amelia's personality. No, thank you so much for doing this, Amelia. This was wonderful. As you see, a lot of people, and also I've been sort of seeing who joined the meeting, and I can tell you a lot of them are our students, but a lot of them are also Brown students who are in other departments. So I think there's just a lot of broad interest in what you were talking about, and thanks a lot for sharing with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Taking public humanities out into the world outside of Brown. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Amelia. Stay in touch.
And if anyone has any questions, feel free to reach out. I might be slow to respond, but I definitely will respond.
Thank you.
Good luck, good health.
Yeah.
Thank you. You too.
Okay. Bye. Thanks everyone for coming.